Hello, I'm Lorena Caminhas, and I am a research fellow in the Interdisciplinary Research Group on Science and Technology from the State University of Campinas, Brazil. Today, I'm going to discuss some particular dynamics of the Brazilian platform-based sex market, which means I am discussing the adult webcam industry in the country, which is the only platform-based sex market to date. And I am focusing today on 2 points: the monopolization of the domestic digital sex trade by only two platforms, and how sex workers negotiate their work conditions and organize themselves to overcome platforms' control. So here's my research aim. Understand the platform's dynamic within the Brazilian adult webcam platforms. Comprehend first how this dynamic is related to platforms' specific model adapted to the Brazilian domestic market. The second one, apprehend how digital sex workers deal with the labor conditions established by platforms, finding forms to thrive on the digital sex trades. So this research is based on a 4-year ethnographic research, and I investigated the two leading Brazilian webcamming platforms, Camera Hot, founded in 2010, and Camera Private, the largest one, founded in 2013. And both of them are premium platforms where users pay for only private shows. And I also conducted ethnography on Twitter. In this research, I also performed 15 in-depth interviews with the webcam performers. So let's go to my findings. So since 2010, both platforms I studied started to monopolize the Brazilian webcamming market and the digital domestic market. They did it by implementing a trade modality that promised to decentralize the sex industry, allowing sex workers to coordinate and manage all the phases concerning commercial sex. So sex workers could control the production, advertisement, distribution, and sales of the sex trade. However, what the platforms did was monopolize the domestic market. And they did it using two different strategies. Camera Hot established the Gold Show, which is a form of group show where sex workers define a tip goal that must be reached until a scheduled date, the date the show will happen. The gold shows were responsible for concentrating workers on Camera Hot as they offer two advantages to sex workers. They allow to earn more tips than in private shows, and they make sex workers famous, which increases the number of users on their rooms. In response, Camera Private established the exclusivity system. This is a system, in fact, a kind of contract where sex workers agree to only work on Camera Private in exchange for some benefits. And for example, to have the most visible spots on the platform and low transaction fees. And because of this specific system, Camera Private is today the largest webcaming platform in Brazil, having 4,000 active performers. In comparison, Camera Hot has only 800 active performers. So as both platforms managed to concentrate the webcamming market, they started to define how the market would work. They established high transaction fees, 50%. They intervened in performances and content prices. Camera Hot still define standard prices for all shots except for the Go shows. And both platforms also set up high entry barriers, selecting the workforce, composed mostly of white cisgender young women. So this is how the auto webcam industry works today in Brazil. So let's find out how sex workers do with it. So as platforms monopolized the domestic digital sex market, sex workers became more dependent on them. But it doesn't mean that they are fully subjected to the platforms. So Brazilian webcam performers recognize the beauty in the platform economy. There are several advantages brought about by platforms and also lots of control that demand strategy to overcome platforms regulation. If, on the one hand, platforms monopolize the markets, on the other hand, they decentralize the production process, and this, according to sex workers, favors them. Two sex workers I talked to, platforms actually allowed them to develop their personal enterprise in a formal and controlled space where they can establish a multi-sided commerce. Sex workers consider that they indeed control what they want to sell, for whom they will sell, and their work time as well. Platform also allowed a more formal trade where all transactions are registered and workers can count on the contracts they sign up with the platforms. The formality is pretty important for workers as they consider that those contracts offer security to them and some limits to the platform. Formalization to sex workers I talked to makes sex labor more accepted as it seems to be a regular labor. Platforms also offer privacy and security to operate on digital sex trades. So, for example, in Brazil, all platforms allow performers to conceal their face and also their voice in performances or content. So it's common in Brazil that the performers to film or photograph from their neck down. Platform allow blocking or banning users, and performers thus consider that platforms provide a safe and regulated space for them to work, where users have to follow all the rules. Finally, they recognize that platforms are a source of stable income, especially throughout membership subscriptions. They allow high profitability when compared to other forms of indirect sex services. So this is an image that demonstrates the main elements that compound the platform-based sex market according to sex workers I interviewed. So formalization, security and privacy, stable income, controlled market, flexibility, and also a form of dependence. So sex workers also recognizes that platforms regulate and manage the labor, thus creating obstacle and disadvantageous terms in the digital sex trade. The platforms constantly change transaction fees, they control market prices, they regulate the visibility or invisibility of the sex work. Aiming to circumvent these obstacles, workers use Twitter both to communicate with each other and also to promote their brand and content. On Twitter, sex workers establish a support network and a channel to demand improvements on platforms dynamic. Also, on Twitter, they sell their content and redirect users to premium platforms where they need to pay to have access to content or performances. Twitter becomes then a kind of mediator of the digital sex economy and a space for sex work to develop their own brands and own enterprises. Also, Brazilian webcam performances founded, mediated by Twitter, the first cam collective in the country, the Paradise Cam. It was founded in 2019, using exactly their connection on Twitter to organize a support network and a space where they could manage all sales independently of the webcamming platforms. So in the sense, they tried to create a channel where they could make transactions direct to customers and where they could share the experiences. This collective had much appeal between sex workers until the end of the last year. Unfortunately, right now it is in decreasing and sex workers are coming back to the platform. To end my presentation, I want just to make some comments that sex work itself has always been an informal and precarious and sometimes dangerous form of work. Platforms then, considering my interviewees, enable a controlled, formalized, open environment where sex workers can engage in multi-sided economic exchange on their own. However, platforms also establish this environment in exchange for the concentration and monopolization of the markets, increasing and strengthening their own enterprises. This process certainly makes sex workers more dependent and subordinate to platforms' infrastructures and affordances. And the sex workers with whom I talked to recognize this double-faced process, pointing to the pros and cons it brings to their work conditions. When compared to other forms of sex labor, platform-based sex labor can be considered as an open and, in fact, self-managed form of work in which the third party, the platforms, also contribute to the workers' enterprises. So my research shows that when it comes to informal and precarious labor, platforms bring a ability in which some advantages are offered to the workers and advantages that come together with control and regulation of the work. I want to leave you with a quote from Angelica, a 27 years old performer, who explained to me in her own words how she understands platform stability. So let's see. I find this very interesting comment, and she was commenting with me about webcamming. Webcamming is much more profitable and stable due to the platforms. And the platforms brought me the possibility to be there voluntarily, talk and show myself to people, make my schedule and my goals. Of course, I know the platforms control my work, my time, my money, but still they give me more freedom and more security. They allow me to develop my business, the business I want, and I have what I want and do what I want. At least I am not exposed in a totally informal market such as prostitution. With this, I end my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.